Ever since America began as a country, people have been fear-mongering about the fall of the Republic. It feels like, today especially, the word dictator is being thrown around more carelessly than ever. Trump recently got asked if he will be dictator during his second term, to which he replied,
He says, "You're not going to be a dictator, are you?" I said, no, other than day one.
So I was curious if there is any precedent for dictatorship in our history. Now, the hardest part of this is, of course, to discern what counts as a dictatorship and what doesn't. Because if you can attach that label to any president you dislike, for example, it loses all meaning, even in contexts where it perhaps would be appropriate. So, for example, we're not talking about joke dictators like Joshua Norton, the self-proclaimed Emperor of California. We are also not talking about King George III, because the label dictator does not fit a king, especially not an English king who rules in parliament. No, a fair definition of dictatorship is when someone subverts or destroys existing democratic institutions and usurps power for themselves, like Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, and Napoleon. Which means we're not talking about George Washington or any other person who wielded a lot of political power while our institutions were still in the process of being set up. Finally, we're not talking about democratically elected presidents who, according to some people, have been or have aspired to be dictators, or who get accused of having eroded our democratic institutions through their actions. So at least for the purposes of this video, Trump does not count. Neither does Joe Biden, neither does Obama, nor do George Bush, FDR, Woodrow Wilson, or Abraham Lincoln. They were all elected and left office on time, with democratic institutions still intact. Also, they are not the type of person we're looking for, because you would know a dictator when you see one. If by nothing else, then just by the sense of dark majesty he or she would project. If we had a Caesarean figure in our history on the federal level in America, we would simply never hear the end of it. That figure would constantly be in our national consciousness, the way Hitler is in that of Germans, and the way Napoleon lives in the national consciousness of the French. So, on the first glance, no one really qualifies. Although, from what I'm hearing about Justin Trudeau, Canada may soon have an example for the history books. Overall, though, it looks like we have never experienced a real dictatorship in North America, being God's chosen continent and all that. However, if you now consider national subdivisions, the US states and Canadian provinces, then as far as I can tell, there are actually two instances that qualify as a dictatorship. 2 times in North American history there are where an entire state or province was for a time run by one man who subverted its democratic institutions and ruled it with virtually no limits on his power. And you see, I'm saying North America because the first of the two is from Canada. Maurice Duplessis was a politician from Quebec, and I learned about this guy from a book titled Is Eating People Wrong? Quebec is Canada's only French-speaking province. It used to be one of the 2 main areas of French settlement in North America, the other one being Louisiana. Because the British were worried that Quebec might want to join the Americans in their rebellion, they granted them special rights and various guarantees, which meant that Quebec could preserve its French institutions and identity. This also meant that Quebecois political culture was inherited from France rather than from England, as it was in the rest of Canada and most of the US. In Quebec history, the time between 1944 and 1959 is referred to as La Grande Noirceur, the Great Darkness, and it corresponds to the premiership of a certain Maurice Duplessis, who was in power for 15 years and 4 elections. First, there is a question. Why didn't the Democratic Federal Government of Canada intervene? And the reason is that because of the special status that was granted to Quebec, the French-speaking Quebecois were usually left to sort out their own affairs. And is it really the business of Anglo-Saxon English-speaking Canadians to tell the French-speaking Quebecois not to have a dictator? Maybe that's just how they prefer to live. The only times the Canadian federal institutions intervened against Duplessis was to rule on some legal cases that were escalated all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court. Taking years and even decades to deliberate, the federal court eventually struck down one of Duplessis' laws, and once fined him $25,000 for persecuting Jehovah's Witnesses. However, No one tried to, for example, send in the troops to rescue democracy. Now, how did he manage to become a dictator in a country that is part of the free world? In order to subvert democratic institutions to the extent where they would follow every instruction without questions, the first step was to secure money supply. After getting elected, Duplessis perpetuated a long-running battle with the federal government in Ottawa over funding, subsidies, and Quebec's right to collect taxes, most importantly, personal and corporate income tax, as well as taxes on inheritance and gasoline. Having secured the money and his power base, Duplessis began an extensive program of public works, which extended his personal stature and ensured the necessary and often illicit electoral funding from those businesses that then came to be in his personal and political debt. The giving of government contracts by means of a fair public tender was outright dismissed by Duplessis, who said that tenders are hypocritical. A government always gives business to its friends, never to its enemies. These outright corrupt practices went largely unchecked in Quebec, even if roundly condemned in the rest of Canada. But in Quebec, the Great Darkness was a time in which corruption reached legendary proportions. The system of political patronage that Duplessis set up, where one promotes friends and removes enemies, meant that at least for a time, one man ran a province on North American soil without any institutional restrictions on his authority. In 1945, he consolidated his power further by appointing himself to various ministerial positions, among them the positions of Provincial Attorney General and Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs. Of course, why would you give positions to anyone else? Duplessis was the state, or as he put it himself, I am the one who makes history in Quebec. I am the boss. The boss is a translation from French, and in Quebec, Maurice Duplessis was simply known as Le Chef, a French variation on the Italian Il Duce, the Spanish El Caudillo, and the German Der Führer. Duplessis ruled Quebec with an autocratic spirit and treated it as his own fiefdom. The regime was operated by men who would take their orders without question. Office appointees were selected for loyalty to the chef, rendering revolt highly improbable. In fact, so secure was his power that when he left for a holiday in Bermuda, he did not appoint a lieutenant, but kept micromanaging Quebec over the telephone, which led to some people calling it the only portable dictatorship in the democratic world. Le Chef's regime continued unchallenged until his death from a stroke in 1959. No one was able to remove him as long as he lived. After his death, his regime suffered the same fate as that of Napoleon, Hitler, Alexander the Great, and others. It collapsed with the departure of the man at the center of it. Then Quebec had what was called the Quiet Revolution, where the chef's system of political patronage was dismantled and a slightly embarrassed Quebec returned to democracy. The other person qualifying as dictator comes from the United States. And this one might be a bit more controversial, because the American progressive left tends to like this guy. In America, there is one state called Louisiana, located in the swamp around the Mississippi River Delta. It is the only place in the US where there was significant French settlement, enough to bring over French government institutions and political traditions. That state also produced a man whom FDR called the most dangerous man in American politics. Here is a historian's account of that time. Increasingly, in the early 1930s, journalists from around the country and the world were drawn to Baton Rouge to witness one of the most remarkable spectacles in American politics, the sessions of the Louisiana legislature. There, in the solemn splendor of the new state capitol, amidst gleaming marble, polished wood, shining brass, and rich carpeting, the elected representatives of the people of Louisiana assembled to transact the public business. And there, running it all, moving incessantly from committee meeting to committee meeting, from House to Senate, was a man with no official standing in the state government, United States Senator Huey P. Long. Marching uninvited into virtually every important committee meeting, Long explained in a few vague words the substance of the bills he wanted enacted. Then, often without even calling for a vote, he declared them approved and sent them to the full House or Senate for consideration. In the larger chambers, he was equally brazen. The clerk would mumble a few words of a bill. Huey Long, standing just below the podium and bellowing instructions at his floor leaders, would call for a vote, and the legislators, often not even knowing what they were voting for, would dutifully pass it. The opposition, increasingly demoralized and with each passing election fewer in numbers, rarely intervened. Even Long's supporters, who surely chafed at their lack of opportunities to posture and expound, seldom dared to speak, knowing that a curt "shut up" or "sit down" from Huey would almost certainly cut them off. On one occasion, the state senate passed 44 bills, introduced for the first time only the night before, in a little over 2 hours, or at an average of fewer than 3 minutes each. Similarly to Maurice Duplessis, Huey Long had a cool dictatorial nickname, the Kingfish, which admittedly looks a bit out of place next to the Führer and the Duce. Like Duplessis, Long used the patronage system in Louisiana to its full extent, clearing the way for his own appointees to various positions, and then collecting a tithe from their paychecks to put into his election fund. To pass bills, he would literally run the legislature by himself, shouting at legislators who dared want to get in the way of passing bills. Even as senator, he ran the state to the point that his political opponents began considering armed opposition, and he was getting bills passed without being read or discussed. One such bill authorized the state to fine and imprison anyone infringing on the state's 10th Amendment powers, aimed at FDR should he come to visit. Louisiana, politically speaking, was Huey Long. He was the state. Famously, he told a legislator who had suggested that a bill of his violated the state constitution, "I'm the constitution around here now," which is kind of exactly what you would expect an American dictator to say. "But sir, this goes against the Constitution." "I am the Constitution." There are some people who say that he used his absolute power to do good in the state. For example, the Kingfish used the National Guard to root out gambling and prostitution in New Orleans, confiscating cash, burning gambling equipment, and arresting prostitutes. There had been no request for state military help, nor was there any martial law put in place to give legal grounding for such actions. He just did it because no one could stop him or refuse his order. The Kingfish had turned the Louisiana National Guard into his personal force. Now, what about elections? He couldn't just have suspended elections, could he? And he didn't, but as everybody knows, holding elections doesn't make you a democracy. Russia has elections and boasts every time about how transparent they are. The Kingfish's electoral victories were marred by rampant claims of voter fraud. For example, in some districts, it was so blatant that voting records showed that voters cast their votes in alphabetical order. His other methods were even less subtle. Shortly before his 1930 election, Huey Long abducted a prominent critic of his, a certain Sam Irby, who was exposing Long's corruption. Irby was abducted by Long's bodyguards shortly before the election and released shortly after. Then, surrounded by the Kingfish's guards, who, by the way, were nicknamed the Cossacks for some reason, he gave an address in which he confessed that he had actually asked Long for protection himself and how grateful he was for it. Unlike Maurice Duplessis, Huey Long didn't get to die a natural death. Eventually, some Americans had had enough, and he was shot. Sic semper tyrannis. The controversial thing about the Kingfish, though, is that he was a man of the people. He got things done that most people wanted. He put state money to use in improving the lives of the people he ruled over, building schools, hospitals, and other infrastructure. He created various welfare programs, put a cap on how much you could own, and forcibly redistributed wealth. To this day, you'll find progressive left political commentators that admire him. The first thing to observe is that both instances of dictatorship in North America followed a similar pattern. The Kingfish and the Chef had many things in common. Each leader ruled autocratically over a virtually one-party state. Both Quebec and Louisiana are unique among the US states and Canadian provinces in that they have a French rather than Anglo heritage, the only two regions in North America where initial French settlement was intensive enough to lay a foundation for government institutions. Both were Latin French enclaves set down in a country of Anglo-Saxons. Duplessis ruled a province which was Roman Catholic by a heavy majority in a Protestant Canada. Long ruled a state disproportionately Roman Catholic, by contrast, to the heavily Protestant United States. Quebec and Louisiana are also distinctive from most of their fellow states and provinces in being of the part of the country with a heritage of military defeat at the hands of the national majority. Louisiana was a part of the Confederacy. Quebec was conquered by the Anglo-Canadians and still had political slogans like "Avenge the defeat at the cradle" in the 20th century, in this case calling for higher birth rates. Finally, both Louisiana and Quebec were poor and rural relative to the US and Canadian average. Both the Chef and the Kingfish created the political machine they wielded in power, and each machine collapsed upon the death of its creator. Descriptions of how both men bullied their theoretically democratic legislatures are strikingly similar. In both cases, the broad masses of the people didn't mind. The dictators enjoyed popular support, playing an almost messianic role of a people's tribune, cleaning up what many perceived as a corrupt system. Both operated in an environment of almost third world cynicism about the supposedly democratic process. Huey Long was in power from 1928 to 1935, and Duplessis ruled Quebec from 1944 to 1959. So perhaps you can make the economic argument as well, linking their rise to power to the Great Depression. These examples constitute the two most striking pieces of precedent for dictatorship in North America. From it, we can catch a glimpse of what an American dictatorship would look like should it come about, and what conditions would make it possible. The fall of democracy and a transformation of the republic into a dictatorship is a story that is familiar to most Americans, whether from watching Star Wars or from reading about the end of the Roman Republic and the rise of its first dictators, Lucius Sulla and Julius Caesar. Are we going to get a Caesarean figure in America? Someone who will tower over American history the way Napoleon towers over the history of France? Someone to rebuild our infrastructure and cleanse our inner cities of criminals? A messianic figure the entire nation can look up to? Someone who shows that with enough political will you can ignore legal constraints? Someone who understands Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction? Someone who is too strong to be trammeled by a class of crooked lobbyists and cringing middlemen? An incorruptible autocrat who by his mighty hand will destroy the enemies of the American people with extreme prejudice? Well, most likely not. At least not judging by the precedent set by Huey Long and Maurice Duplessis. The conditions which gave rise to the Kingfish and the Chef don't really seem to be present in the US today. First of all, Americans are too wealthy. There may be enough economic misery around to give Donald Trump a second term in office, but perhaps not for a dictatorship. Also, unlike Quebec and Louisiana, or Weimar Germany, or modern Russia, America doesn't really have a history of defeat which needs to be avenged. Sure, we left Afghanistan, but that doesn't really affect our self-perception as a nation. It does not create an image of victimhood, a narrative of oppression where average Americans suffer daily at the hands of cruel mujahideen conquerors. No, if America suffered a real defeat, we would all know it. Moreover, the English-speaking peoples in general are never eager to overthrow their governments. Our institutions are typically too enduring to be subverted by one man. Both examples in this video came from a region where institutions were French in origin and inherited a French political culture. In France, of course, democratic institutions have ceased their function a number of times just within the last 2 centuries, and currently they are on their 5th republic. France has a presidential system with broad executive powers vested in the president himself. Their current head of state, Emmanuel Macron, has been called a Jupiterian president, unchallenged and detached from trivialities, introducing changes by executive decree. In the English-speaking world, calling someone a Jupiterian president would be a strong condemnation. Look, this man seeks to usurp our institutions. But in France, one cannot help but read a certain yearning from those words. Do the French yearn for a Caesar? But Americans, for all their complaining, are not nearly cynical enough to lose faith in their system. Many millions are participating in the political process and donating their hard-earned money to their preferred candidates. If anything, the trend seems to be that it is now easier than ever to run a campaign without relying on big donors. Overall, it seems like there is no sufficient cultural foundation, nor are there favorable conditions for a dictatorship in America anytime soon. It looks like democracy is going to survive. But hang on, what if there is a strongly Catholic minority in America, placed in a country of largely Protestant social norms? One that has a history of defeat that needs to be avenged, is somewhat poorer than the average, and has a Latin, Roman heritage. Personally, I am waiting for the arrival of the Mexican-American Caesar.